thank you very much for coming along to the session at lunchtime. This is basically all going to be about the future of mobility, and we're all talking about how easy it is to predict the future and how we're all inevitably going to be right and we all know what's going to happen and so on. But it is a fascinating topic, where it's all going. And we've got 4 brilliant people here to tell you, give you some of the insight into that. So going along the line, we've got James Nicholson, who's UK automotive lead at EY, Russell Phillippe, as founder of Travel Tech Week, Neil Conway, Chief Executive UK Operations at Emovis, and Andy Pascoe, Business Development Director at McLaren Applied Technologies. So please welcome the panel. Right, we thought we'd throw some questions to you for the start to get everyone kind of buoyed up. It's a show of hands thing, so don't worry, you don't have to speak in public. Who thinks fully automated cars are inevitable? And perhaps who thinks they're not inevitable? So this is it's interesting. There are some people. Oh, Paul at the back. Who thinks their grandchildren will still need to learn to drive? Okay, that suggests it's going to take longer than we all think. Who would happily get into a fully automated car on the road now? And it's something I did the other week. Not so many, trusting the technology. Here's an interesting one as well, and we'll talk about all of these as we go along. But who thinks automation will kill off privately owned cars in the end? So no one's going to own a car in the end. Probably about 50-50. Okay, we'll come on to some of those themes in a second, but first of all, we're going to go along the line, and everybody's going to give you a brief pitch about where they think mobility is going. So we'll start with you, James.
Afternoon, everyone. James Nicholson. So why is it interesting for us? We work with automotive companies, engineering companies, energy, utilities, telecoms companies, and there's no doubt that this form of disruption, what we call rather widely future of mobility, is a massive, almost existential challenge for some of them. We sit in a rather unique position that we sort of see it through the different lenses of all those sectors. So for us, this has become a key area for the last few years and something we're investing in very heavily. Do you want me to kick on to the topic in detail? So I think that this is a disruptive influence is without debate, right? We know the societal expectations are changing. We know the technology is coming through at the rate of knots. We know there are new entrants in the players. And I think all of us that are involved, whether the fringes or in the middle of this, can identify with end states. The question that we're asking increasingly is, how do you get there? And then we start asking ourselves 3 very different questions, which is the first is, we need to break down traditional industry silos. This is not a car problem any more than it's a technology problem or a utility and energies problem or anything else. This is going to have to involve greater degrees of collaboration than we've seen in the past. And most companies are starting to dip their toe in the water with strategic partnerships, but are still, as yet, not that comfortable with existing outside their P&Ls. Brings us to the next point. We're going to need to rethink economic models. So that starts to ask ourselves, if we believe that V2I infrastructure is going to be required in order to have cars stopping safely on motorways, then how do we rethink the capital deployment that happens and how do people make money from it? Telecoms companies selling SIM cards and car companies selling cars off the balance sheet probably isn't the answer. So we really need to rethink from the beginning how that happens. And the third point is when we get to government policy and direction setting. And we've heard a lot about the constraints and the controls, but less of the, well, how do we start to talk about economic value so that the private sector can actually, get a run on this? Laissez-faire won't work, neither will prescriptive interventions on a government policy perception, but we do need to start understanding what the moonshots are. I'll throw some things out there. What happens if we get to the point where the congestion zone in London is hands off the wheel by 2026? Does that provide the sort of investment case where companies will start to go, okay, I know where I'm heading, I know what this means? And until we have a self-sustaining economic case behind some of these, I think we're going to see very little progress. So that's the lens we look at it from. Where's the economic value beyond the tech?
Okay, Russell.
Hi. So my name is Russell. I set up a series of events called Travel Tech Week, and the idea of Travel Tech Week is to bring together some of the smarter people in the startup and entrepreneur scene who have kind of got an idea and they've got a vision of how things like cloud computing and modern technology can be used in a way to improve the way travel and transport work in the country. So what we do is we bring them together in workshops and events together with bigger companies. So we've got people in the community like TfL, we've got public transport operators like Arriva who come and talk about their challenges and share some of what they think might be the challenges of today and the future, to give startups kind of some idea of the challenges that they should be thinking about if they want to come up with a solution that could then be potentially attractive to an investor. So that community is growing, and it's good because from my perspective as someone who really is interested in transport itself and also how the future of technology will affect industries like transport, it's good to get a good view about what people think. And as we've seen from the vote just now, a lot of people have different opinions on where things are going, and no one is necessarily going to be right or wrong. So it'll be interesting to see how we all work out today on where we think the future is going to be. But from my perspective, I think it's a really exciting and interesting time at the moment, just because there is so much disruption. So things like Uber yesterday announcing that it's tied up with NASA to offer helipad-based transport. So maybe the future is that we all fly everywhere. If you've got rid of the drivers and you've got rid of the need to refuel and they can charge themselves when they're landed, a lot of those overheads start to come down, and the cost per unit of travel is then maybe potentially close to what it is with a car and a taxi today. So potentially there is scope for transport becoming more convenient and cheaper, and who doesn't want transport to be more convenient, faster and cheaper? So I think we'd probably all agree that the future is going to be more convenient, cheaper and quicker. It's just, how is that going to look? So I think my perspective will be looking at it from a public transport perspective, the ownership model. So will people own cars, as we asked earlier? Will people own the cars, or will they just jump in a car that happens to be coming along, which is owned by either another company or a central government? So these are all things that I think it'll be good to kind of explore today.
It's interesting, you're both talking about money. If it's going to be cheaper, does that mean there's less money to be made, or a smaller pool? Or like you were saying, who's going to make the money? Where is the money going to be?
Yeah, well, we talked quite a lot earlier, just behind, about the economic model, and there's quite a lot of examples of where companies have gone in and gone, oh, this looks like a good idea, we're going to test this out. So I think one of the examples was a self-driving car that went from a shopping centre to a car park. So people would come, park their car, and then go on a self-driving car into the shopping centre. But what it looked like was potentially, and this is obviously just my opinion, potentially not that much research had been done, given that there was no room in the actual pod to put your shopping, and given it was going from a shopping centre to a car park, you would expect people to be going in one direction at least with some shopping. So maybe it was just, we want to try and see if it works, and we want to, just test the technology in a scenario where people are probably going to use it, rather than actually looking at who's getting the value out of this. Is the customer willing to pay whatever it was, £1 or £2 per journey, or is that going to be prohibitive for them?
Okay, Neil.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Neil Conway. I work for emovis in the UK. Emovis are a specialist division of Abertis, who are actually a worldwide toll road operator. Okay, so I guess our perspective is the number of vehicles on the road, which I guess uniquely, the more vehicles on the road is a good thing for our organisation. But clearly, the growing traffic concerns that there are at the moment are something that we need to keep pace with. I guess from a backdrop where you've got, I think the latest numbers I saw was £1.4 trillion lost on productivity for congestion. 22% of all CO2 emissions come from vehicles worldwide. And there's something like 1.2 million deaths on the road from accidents, and on top of that, there's 20 to 30 million injuries due to road traffic accidents. And I guess what does that look like going forward? The projection is there's 1 billion cars on the road today worldwide. That's going to go up by another 600k if you believe the projections. How do we sort of combat some of those growing concerns around traffic using technology? Okay, so I guess that's the perspective. Be that some of the things, smart motorways, big data, better use of congestion tools generally going forward, and using obviously the information that's contained within the vehicle to reduce congestion going forward, to try and reduce some of those climate change type issues that we're facing.
I think data, again, is going to be really key. Talk about it a lot, like who owns it, who gets the money out of it, who shares it. All of that we can start looking into because it's so critical, isn't it? But before that, from McLaren, Andy.
Sure, thank you. So I'm Andy Pascoe. I work for McLaren. It's the same McLaren that you'd probably see every 20 times a year racing a Formula One team, 4,000 supercars a year, and we've also decided then to try and apply our skills and technologies into two other sectors, health and transport. What we specifically are interested in, although autonomy and battery technology and electrification are very much on our agenda as well, is mobility as a service. And you alluded, Richard, earlier on to ownership models and whether or not we'll all own a car in the future. It's much more, for us, it's about connecting modes of transport, providing an end-to-end journey, and the technologies that need to be applied to allow that to happen, as well as the business rules and the policy and the regulation. So that's a space we're very much interested in, mostly because we can see it being a near-term solution. So mobility as a service stops you necessarily spending £20,000 or £500 a month on a vehicle as a rental scheme or as a personal ownership. And it redistributes that value then to a mobility provider. And today, there isn't really a mobility provider in existence. We buy train tickets in one place, we buy a vehicle, we hire a bike from somebody else, and then we walk individually and we pay toll roads, etc. But a mobility provider of the future is a horizontal provider who has access to all of those networks, probably owns the vehicles or subleases the ownership of any vehicles used, has access where we only pay once. We might pay monthly. We get on and off transport without having to worry about whether we got the right ticket. Is it going to the right place? Is it the most efficient way? We pre-configure a service with our desires, and then technology provides us something back that's valuable in return, which costs us less than owning a vehicle, and it redistributes that value then amongst this new mobility provider and the supply chain that new mobility provider will need. Data services, cyber security services. So we very much support the mobility as a service coming into play in the next 5 or so years. There's some existing examples in Europe and the UK already of small-scale regional deployments of this. But that will change the landscape. And something we were talking about earlier was how much that will change the investment in infrastructure, whether it be roads or rail or airports. If their mobility provider is somebody akin to the smartphone phone provider, their pockets are very deep, and their influence is significant. So instead of in the future roads being built where they might be decided by a public sector and the existing supply chain, or rail, for instance, then that mobility provider will have the biggest say. If they have a logistics hub here, and they have 1,000 customers here, and they've got all the money in the world because they're providing a good, valuable service, their voice will be significant in the deployment of new infrastructure. So I think disruption is the key and the buzzword for the next 12 months at least, as it has been for the last 12. But we really believe in the disruption of the infrastructure space as well as the mobility space.
So we hear a lot about mobility as a service. What does that mean in practical terms? Because sometimes I try and visualize it. So you literally potentially have an app on your phone, and you'll say, I want to go from here to here, and then the company designing the app will work out how you get there, and it could be in lots of different ways. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's a good example. So think of mobility as a service potentially as having a mobile phone contract. You don't own the phone. All the services, you have bolt-ons, bolt-offs. You don't get involved with the telecommunications provider. You don't have to worry about where the mast is. You don't have to buy 6 different versions of a service through paper tickets and online integration. You just pay monthly and use your phone whenever you like, wherever you like, if it works. And that is a good example of how mobility as a service will be. You will expect to be able to use any mode of transport between your A and B destinations without having to integrate with more than one company. And if that is via an app, which it probably will be via an app, then that will be the interface. Your whole mobility will be provided by a brand. And the race isn't about the technology necessarily or the hardware. It's about which brands are going to be the brands that become your transport personal assistant of the future. So those people who are lucky enough to have a personal assistant these days, that's a problem they don't worry about. Everything's paid for, all connecting journeys. Somebody's looking after their diary and all of the complexities. Well, if we automate that, and a mobility provider manages to automate that, and offers me a personal assistant that's in my pocket, yes, please. And it costs me less than buying a vehicle, yes, please. And it means I don't have to integrate with multiple providers, yes, please. So it's getting that yes, please out of most of the UK, the world, really, passengers that will really grow the ecosystem.
I didn't see at the start if you guys voted. Did you vote when I did the little questions? I'm quite interested to know what the panel thinks about various things. So a little vote amongst the four of you. Who thinks fully automated cars are inevitable? Everyone. Who thinks it will take longer than many experts predict, whatever those predictions are, but no one's sure.
I think it'll be short.
Who thinks their grandchildren will still have to learn to drive? Is there some kind of test, some kind of manual input? Who would happily get into a fully automated car on the road now? Confident. I'm glad you're confident in technology. Who thinks, this is an interesting one, automation will kill off privately owned cars? You just won't own a car in the future.
I think the ownership thing is a really, really essential component of this. Whether you're looking at EVs or connected and autonomous cars, CAVs as we call them, recognizing the benefits or just the affordability equation is going to require levels of shared ownership. Now, the problem with shared ownership as a whole is it depends which lens you're looking at it from. If you're an OEM selling cars, you definitely want them off your balance sheet, so they have to go somewhere. It's difficult to find necessarily who the slow return player is going to be, and as consumers, not all of us are there yet. My wife coming out of a Sainsbury's on a Tuesday morning in the rain with a load of shopping and 2 kids in tow, she's not yet there. Equally, people who enjoy driving certain things, premium cars, they're not there either. So take the handset analogy. That mobile phone, the idea of me lending that to you today for use is probably repugnant to most of you because there's no content on it. It's not yours. You don't recognize it. There's no contacts and messages. But if I could start to separate the hardware ownership from the software elements of it so that it re-images and it becomes your phone, I'm onto something. And we need to start thinking about elements of mobility as a service, certainly as far as the car, as we know it today, goes. How does that ownership model start to change to make it acceptable and less repugnant? And that might be an answer through technology. It might be quite equally just different ownership models that could go as far as blockchain-enabled solution whereby groups of citizens own it and there is no balance sheet. So we have to, again, solve that and understand where the asset sits and how it's used.
Russell, do you think people will be reluctant to give up their car? It's a nice thing to have. It's a status symbol. It's, mobility. It's a nice thing to drive as well. It's just a physically nice object, isn't it?
At the moment, yes, but that's because they haven't seen the alternative, I think. I think in the future, you will get the car that you need for the purpose you need to conduct for that particular point in time. So, if you're moving house, for example, something will come along with a lot of space, or if you want to go out and drive in the country or go somewhere with a bit more fun, you can go in a smaller car. So I think at the moment it's kind of hard for people to understand what that means to go from a model where you own the car, and actually a lot of people don't even own the car that they own because they've had on finance and actually they don't own it technically. So we've kind of already got the model. It's just that that's a very limited version of it because you can only use that one car. Whereas if you had that model where you don't own the car like you don't now in a lot of cases, but you can choose from a number of cars depending on what your needs are, I think people will then see the benefit, and they'll see the benefit of, okay, they've got their own car, which needs to be, as we were talking about earlier, it needs to be charged every day to make sure it's ready for you to go, versus a car that's always being charged by someone else. It's kind of like that virtual assistant that we were talking about. It's always fuel, it's always maintained, the tires are always checked. you know, it's going to be a lot safer because of all those things that are happening by other people for you, because they are responsible for the fleet, versus you just being responsible for maintaining your own car. Something goes wrong, you've got to shell out some money to have it repaired. I think very quickly people will see the benefit and go, why am I paying for a car which I hardly ever use when actually everyone's got a much better car than me now? So I think it's just because we don't have the alternative to see it, what it looks like, it's kind of like people probably are reluctant, yeah.
But doesn't the fact that so many people are going out and getting cars on tick effectively demonstrate that people like having a car? For all of the hassle of it, people actually like having a car sitting outside.
But that's because at the moment that's the only way you can have a car sitting outside ready for you to get into. In the future, there will be one outside, but it just won't be yours. It'll be kind of coming past and it'll be there for you to take, a bit almost like a taxi.
Neil, I want to talk to you about in a second about whether the technology is ready for some of this as well. But Andy, just quickly, obviously from McLaren, does this mean we're sort of everyone just gets some really boring kind of car appearing because that's, you know, the cheapest one that the app company is going to buy, or will you still be able to call up a very nice McLaren even though it's not yours?
Of course, yeah. So definitely not, in my opinion and our opinion. So it deserves to be diverse. So there's no suggestion in mobility as a service that there'll be a reduction in any of the options you have today. I mean, have all the options you like, have all the car models you like. It's just now configurable by choice. So rather than I want a car for the next 3 years until it's paid off and then I trade it back in again, Monday I'm going somewhere where I want to impress whoever I'm going with. I want a McLaren. Other cars are available. Tuesday, I want a transit van because I'm moving house. Wednesday, I don't need a car at all. Thursday, I need a train, and Friday, I need a bike, and Saturday, I need all of them because I've got a busy day. That's the option and the simplicity that's provided by a mobility service environment. I can book, just like I'd book in my Outlook diary, what I'm going to do next week. I'll also book at the same time what transport requirements I've got, and let all of the complexity of booking that be taken on by somebody else who makes a profit doing it. And I'll just rent that service from them. That's mobility as a service. Take transport as a problem and a pain point away from me and give me much more value back in return. And that's what you get from other industries. We mentioned mobile phone industry. There's a number of other as-a-service industries that put the customer and their needs as the focus. At the moment, if you buy a car, if you have to get a train ticket, then that's all the choice that you have. You don't have any more option. And certainly if you want to change, it gets very much more difficult. So actually, I can't buy a McLaren today, honest. But tomorrow I could have one for a day. I know you can get one for a day now, but it's very expensive. It takes a very long time. There's lots of insurance. And then I have to do that with a new company I've never met before and sign a lot of forms in case I crash. What about if it was just my normal mobility provider that also yesterday provided me a bus ticket, but tomorrow will provide me a McLaren? And then the next day, something more utilitarian. That's mobility service. More choice, more simply, more personalized.
But is there enough money in it for the car company? Because at the moment, if you get a cab, you just get the cab that turns up. You don't pay double for a really nice cab.
Well, there's a redistribution model here. So how much money is sunk by the private ownership landscape into OEMs, and where does that money go? So I won't mention other car operators' names. It will feel like I'm picking them out. But assume that all of the car manufacturers globally and all the profits and all the money that's going to them, if a significant proportion of that stopped going there and started instead being redistributed into a different supply chain for mobility, there's plenty of money around. A 20 or 30,000 pound average car, 15 if you like, whatever the number is, half of that money personally being spent over that same 3-year cycle period just for mobility makes enough money for the industry to flourish. So this is a redistribution. This is taking away from your traditional OEM supply chain of vehicles and putting it into a service model where you get a lot more for your money and it doesn't sit for 96% of the time on the floor not moving.
Neil, we're painting the picture of a future where all of this is happening. Where is the technology at the moment? Because presumably you need infrastructure and technology to have autonomous cars driving around and electric charging points, and if you're going to charge people per mile, you know, it all takes infrastructure, doesn't
Absolutely.
it? And it feels like we're quite a way behind on some of that. Where do we actually stand?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. You know, to really make the model that's been described work, does need, you know, a smart, intelligent infrastructure, road infrastructure. Where are we now? Well, we move in, you know, you can see evidence that there's movement towards, you know, better use of data in relieving congestion. You know, we now have metering on ramps onto motorways and highways. You know, congestion charge, you know, tolling is now free flow, or can be free flow. So there is some movement, but there's a significant investment to really make the autonomous car model work, certainly to the degree that we're talking about today.
And presumably that's public money, because what car company is going to stump up for things by the road?
As we sat here today, it probably would be public money, but who's to say that the investment model of the future is completely different in terms of supporting that?
James, do you think governments are going to be willing to invest in this? I mean, the government talks a good game on all future transport, doesn't it? But actually, is it going to put the money behind it?
I think we need to be careful how we invest. So the government's role must not be to get everyone hooked on subsidiary junkies. That's a bad model. If you can set direction of travel for economic sustainability, that's a good model. There's a point about rethinking these value chains, right? So where is private and public sector money being put today? I'm going to pick on two areas today, but there are others, and I know I won't make myself particularly popular with everyone in the room, but what do we spend on our smart highways upgrades, and how much of that proportion is going into overhead gantries? That's a very large capital spend on infrastructure that we know to be relatively redundant quite soon. If we're moving to V2I infrastructure, head-up displays, we could take the analog TV set-top box model and just have a TomTom with the lane closed type idea. There's other ways to think through this. We could free up funds. If we look at network infrastructure and communications and what needs to happen for low latency to exist there, are we right to continue as a government and a private sector to pursue network layer competition whereby we're going to have 4 or 5 duplicate 5G access networks? Or can we start to migrate faster, as other countries have done, towards service layer competition? So it's those sorts of decisions, I think, that are going to be much more important in real economic sustainability terms than just, shall I put this bung of cash into this next tech subsidy or service subsidy?
I guess the gantry people would suggest that they're bridging the gap, aren't they? Because before it all gets fantastic and 5G and all the rest of it, you've got to have gantries.
Very possibly so. So I will stand very corrected. I'm sure there's a pathway.
Yeah. Out of interest, if someone wants to ask a question, you pop your hand up. That's fine. You wouldn't need a microphone, I don't think, here. So if you do want to ask a question or make a point, yes. I think we might need a big shout, actually. Oh, we can get a microphone to you. Brilliant. OK. We have the technology.
Good afternoon. My background is in aviation, and for the last 30 years, aircraft, Boeing 747, you've been able to press a button, take off, press a button, cruise, press a button, land. Now, how many people here would fly in an aircraft without a pilot? The fact is, or one of the facts is, a pilot, the human being, causes more air accidents than any other technical or weather or whatever, crashes, and they kill more people. They say that the aviation industry is the safest in the world, and it's getting safer. But that's if you take it as miles per passenger. If you take it as number of journeys, it's about as safe as a motorbike. There are ways of looking at these things. But I believe that you can get carried away with technology. I don't believe you ever do away with a boy racer. I don't care how you try and control things. There'll always be people who want to drive the car themselves, and they want to do it fast. They want to try and overcome any restrictions you put on it. I remember when I was in Saudi Arabia in the RAF, they used to have a restriction on the speed on your vehicle, so that when the needle went over a certain amount, alarm went off. They drilled a hole in the front of the dial and put a matchstick in. People will always try and overcome technology. You shouldn't try and rely on it. However, there is a role where to make things safer. We're talking about the accidents that we have. Well, one of the major causes of accidents is falling asleep or tiredness. Now, that is something where I think technology can be useful. It can have sensors to see how alert people are. And I think that would be a major one. They can also have sensors which tells you the safe distance of the vehicle in front. That it warns you that you're getting too close for the speed that you're driving.
Okay, I think two good points there, Race, which I'll put to these guys. The first one, I guess, is like security, system security, hacking, that kind of thing. We've got automation. And the second one is, what do you think the safety benefits could be of all of this technology? So who'd like to kick off, first of all, with the security risks?
I'll kick off on the safety side. Certainly, you know, I think McKinsey's have done some work on accident reduction for autonomous cars, and they think that the accidents will reduce by 90%. Okay, you know, that's a forecast, right? So who knows? But if you think that, you know, we talked about investment a minute ago, that the cost of injuries worldwide, I think in developed and prospering countries is about 3% of GMP, and in sort of lower income countries is as high as 5%. So, you know, you start to reduce accidents, then there's a pot of money somewhere, yeah, that's no longer needs to be spent on actually the injuries and the health implications to that.
Are we taking the security side of it seriously enough as well, that cars being hacked?
I don't believe so. No, not that there aren't good people in the UK or across the world to help with this, the problem, but it's a much bigger problem than we anticipate. If the adoption will disappear, nobody will want to get into a car that hasn't got a driver if it's frequently hacked or if it causes a death. You know, but harping back to this point, it's very important, the security side, but the safety side is actually one of the biggest cases. It's not just that 90% improvement in safety. Actually, 90% of all accidents that happen today in a car are because of a human error. So there's and just in the UK, which has very safe roads, 2,000 people a year, 1,700 people a year died last year, 20,000 killed and seriously injured. So I encourage Highways England, or whoever it is, to talk about weekly road accidents, deaths, killed and seriously injured, in what could have been prevented had technology played a role. There are some things humans don't do today because technology is better at doing it. This is one of those things. Not driving as a skill, avoiding accidents. So people do get tired. They don't operate a vehicle under the optimum circumstances all the time. And then they have lapses in concentration. And the difference between a lapse in concentration in a human and in a computer, let's call it for now, or an automated solution, is vast. There's lots less. And don't think of it in my phone crashed this morning, so my car would have crashed. That's not how the system is being designed to work. It's being designed to work to take away those momentary lapses, those suboptimal conditions that people drive in now. So I put the challenge not to these people in the room to make it confrontational, but certainly to the network providers to say how many of these deaths each year could have been prevented if the technology we know that exists today was deployed ubiquitously, and therefore shouldn't we accelerate it if we can?
James, you were talking about collaboration earlier, but how realistic is that? Because there's a lot of money to be made, but no one's quite sure who's going to make it. You've got sort of tech firms and car firms, and I know they have these collaborations. I keep reading about them, but really, are they really sharing? Because there's just too much at stake, isn't there?
Starting to, I would say, was my view. There are partnerships between the technology firms and the OEMs, for example, that are starting to move in the right direction, but they're tentative. I think a lot of them are still nervous. If we take data, most of the questions around, we're pretty sure there's value there, but we're really questioning the future of the data ownership. And that may be the wrong way to think about it, because the value is probably not discovered yet, and we're going to have to hold fire on data ownership till a little bit later, and then let that value flow. The OEMs in particular, building cars, have built their value on engineering secrets and technology advances and staying one step ahead of the curve. Getting them to crack out of a P&L and balance sheet view of the world is very hard. So I think it's going to be by demonstration of those that win. I think it's going to be by force that those new entrants that come in on a down cycle, for example. So the next 5 years will be really interesting for the car world. Will the new entrants and the tech players take advantages of thin margins and slowdowns in cash flow from the traditional players? And the third one will be by encouragement. So we look at entities that have been set up like Meridian that have been designed deliberately to drive that collaboration with funding, with a coffee shop mentality around cross-sector plays. So if we can get some progress on that, and it should be where the UK can take a lead, will be on that cross-sector play, not just on our car industry, I suggest.
Russell, do you think that ultimately it's going to be the tech companies that drive this in the end? We know Apple's working on a car, although what I keep hearing, an autonomous car, but I keep hearing it's less the car and more the software, but who knows? We know what Google's been doing, and that these guys just have bottomless pockets, don't they? So ultimately, ironically, is it going to be the car firms that are following in their wake and disappear off, and the tech firms that drive it?
Well, I think the brands that seem to do the most well are the firms that have elements of both. So if you think about Apple and Google more so now, the way they're able to give the best customer experience to in this case will be passengers, is to actually have control over the whole end-to-end process. So it's from the point at which the customer or the passenger thinks, or maybe they're told that they need to go somewhere for a meeting, given it's linked to their calendar or whatever, all the way through to actually getting them there safely and having that end-to-end value linked to that one brand. I think they're the ones that are going to capitalize on it. I think the partnerships are probably a temporary way of testing the market, but I think ultimately that a company will need to have both. To offer a truly differentiated service, because ultimately a company will do that in the future, and that company will be able to do it better than companies that are doing it in a partnership, just because of that control they have and the value that the customer's attributing to that one brand all the way through. So it might be a joint venture. So it could be a completely new brand that is under the hood, if you like, owned by different companies supplying their different skill sets. But that's not really any different to an iPhone, where you've got SanDisk memory, you've got Samsung screen, X, Y, and Z. Under the hood, you're actually dealing with lots of different companies, but as a person, you just see the Apple logo when you start it up. So you always think about Apple when you're doing whatever you're doing. So I think, it needs to be the best of breed, and like the mobility of the service, as we said earlier, is almost going to become a platform. And that platform has the ability to just take what's working in the market right now, put that into the ecosystem, and let the passengers benefit.
Right, sorry about this. I'm going to spring this on you slightly, but have a few seconds to think about it. I just want to know what you think the biggest barrier is to overcome in terms of sort of getting towards this brave new world of fantastic mobility. You might think it's the politics or I keep hearing about that crossover period where we're sharing the roads with autonomous cars, and what a mess that's going to be. So well, do you want to kick us off, Russell?
For me, it's definitely the people, and obviously people come in lots of different forms. So it could be the current professional drivers. Obviously, they're not going to be very happy that everything's going to be automated. Passengers won't, or car owners won't like to lose their car, as we discussed earlier, because that's got sentimental value. Infrastructure's not there to support multi-mode in terms of automated and manual drive-driven vehicles in the same environment. So I think that's quite a big hurdle to overcome, to get to a point where everything's automated, which is obviously a lot easier to run because all of the vehicles can then talk to each other in a format that they all understand. Whereas at the moment, between human and automated car, you have to almost have a more advanced system to deal with that scenario than you would have after that period. So I think it's going to be challenging from the people perspective. I mean, you look at how difficult it's been to just get the driver to close the doors on the trains, and that's been going on for however many years, and that's just one fairly straightforward piece of technology that's been proven to be effective and safe, but yeah, it's still causing issues. So I think, while people are still involved, that's going to always be a source of friction. I just wanted to come back to your safety point, because I actually, as a cyclist, I was for the very first time knocked off my bike this morning by a tipper truck. And it was quite annoying for me, because I was on the well, obviously because I was on the floor.
Yeah.
But it was quite annoying because I've always looked at these lorries and thinking, they've put all these alerts in and stuff when they're turning, and just didn't have anything. So, and then the guy got out and he said, "Well, you weren't looking at my indicators." I was like, "Well, they weren't even on." So I think, like we said earlier, that the human only has two eyes, and they're only looking at one thing, and they get complacent, and they don't necessarily check their mirrors. Whereas an automated system has sensors all around that are always monitoring themselves as well to check that they're working. So, given my experience today, I think safety could be improved.
Absolutely. Barriers, guys. Anyone else want to chip in on a problem?
Societal understanding of the benefits. We're not very good as an industry. Not many industries are very good at saying what the benefit. There's a famous quote around smartphones 10 years ago to say they did a poll about who'd want a camera in their phone. 12% of people wanted a camera in their phone. Imagine saying that now to your children or to anybody of an emerging youth. Do you want a camera in your phone? What do you mean? I want a phone in my camera. Now, it's not the same way that it is when you assess and survey the society as it is. If you don't explain the benefits well enough, you don't get the answer you want, and then investment decisions are made with poor information. And there's a bit of I think the automotive and other companies are doing quite well in reimagining their brands, but they're doing it in marketing terms and not necessarily in what's going on in their real business terms. So there's a bit of a Fleet Street moment and the sort of horse and carriage moment we talked earlier on about. People will always want to drive, and that might be well the case, but people still didn't want to let go of their horses, but you wouldn't see one of those on the M1 right now. So there are different ways that you have to apply what people can do for the safety and the benefit of society. And I don't want to see lots of people who love riding horses on the M1 tomorrow amongst vehicles that are going 70 miles an hour. So some policy, some regulation has to come in to say that's not allowed. This is for the human good. And so society does need to be described, given the benefits better by us, by the technology providers, by whoever is that's coming in to disrupt. Here's the benefits, not just a camera in your phone. There's a much bigger benefit to the society as a whole.
Okay. Thank you very much for your expertise. Really fantastic, lively debate. Everybody, please thank the panel.